All right, in our next unit, we're going to be talking a lot about metabolism and the reactions that go into that, both glycolysis and the breakdown of glucose, but also photosynthesis a little bit. But before we do that, we need to talk about metabolism in general, and we need to talk a little bit about some of the chemistry behind this. So you're here thinking something about metabolism in your head. Maybe it's something beautiful like this, the hummingbird here coming in for the sugar water, which will give it energy to beat its wings and float around. So graceful, right? When I think of metabolism, I think of something that looks a little bit like this nasty thing right here. All right, doesn't this look fun? So this is kind of the biologist's view of metabolism. The technical definition of metabolism is all the chemical reactions that go on inside of an organism. And these are probably for a microbe, maybe E. coli or something like that. You can see that this is kind of a pathway here, and there are many branches on the pathway. So metabolism is not just breaking things down. So cellulose or sucrose or glycogen or starch or something like that. And they get broken down into glucose, or we have glucose feed in here, and it goes through this process to make ATP at the end of it. So that's a process that breaks things down, but we also have processes that build things up. Here you can see we are building different nucleotides, ATP, GTP. We have amino acids that can be built, threonine, aspartate, and things like this. So the actual reality of metabolism is a bunch of chemical reactions that make and break things. So again, we're going to break this down into two parts. We have the catabolic reactions, or catabolism. These are reactions that break down molecules. And remember, we said these are going to release energy. We're breaking bonds, we're releasing energy. On the other side of things, that energy is usually going to be used to do anabolism. Anabolic reactions, they build larger molecules, but consume energy in the process. So we have breaking stuff, energy is released, making stuff, energy is consumed. And those pathways are obviously going to fit together. Here we're breaking something down, which releases energy, and then we can build things up from that. The reverse is also true. We can take these things and in theory break them down if we need to. So like fatty acids, we can break them down, but we can also build fats as well. So there's two sides of this, but we need to talk first about energy and the movement of energy and a little bit about thermodynamics to really understand these processes properly. So chapter 6.1, we're looking at energy metabolism. We're going to talk about how energy kind of cycles and moves throughout really the universe, but really our Earth is what we're concerned with here. So we'll talk about a little bit about metabolic pathways and describe the two major types of those, and then discuss chemical reactions and how they play a role in transferring energy around. Okay, so you might be familiar with this, right? But we have energy that flows through systems. We can have things like sunlight flowing to plants with their chloroplasts do photosynthesis, which makes glucose and oxygen, which gets used by the mitochondria to make ATP, and in the process make carbon dioxide and water, which filters back into the process, right? This whole flow of energy in living systems is called bioenergetics, the flow of energy through living systems. So when we're studying metabolism, we're studying bioenergetics. And ultimately, all energy on Earth, again, there's exceptions, but for almost everything, all energy is starting with the sun. Okay, there are technically microbes at the bottom of the ocean that never see the sun. They can get energy from hydrothermal vents and stuff like that and do metabolism with weird minerals and things like that. But if you think about it, that relies on the sun, right? Because there'd be no Earth without the sun. So it still relies on the sun. All our energy is coming from sunlight. And then that's getting moved around. We have heat, of course, that comes in. There's always loss in the movement of energy. That's lost as heat. But we then look at something like producers. Those are plants, right? They take that sunlight energy and make sugar out of that. Then consumers, like animals, that are taking that sugar by eating plants or other animals that have eaten plants and breaking that down. But we also have a whole group of decomposers, right, that break down the remnants of these things. But in all these processes, heat is getting made and technically energy is being lost at some point. But all of these things are doing metabolic reactions. They don't always do the same ones. Plants do photosynthesis and glycolysis and stuff like that. We just do the glycolysis side. But these are all metabolic reactions. So metabolism is all of the chemical reactions in a cell, both breaking and building. When I talk about a metabolic pathway, I'm talking about a series of interconnected biochemical reactions. So let me go back to my terrible, ugly diagram here. We have glucose that gets converted into glucose 1P, and then that gets converted into glucose 6-phosphate, and that gets converted into fructose 6-phosphate, and GAD3P, and then to pyruvate, and acetyl-CoA, and oxaloacetate, and blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on. It gets converted to all these different pieces. Each of these steps is part of a metabolic pathway here. And of course, there are enzymes involved in all of this. We're not going to worry too much about the enzyme side of things. If you take like a 400 level biochemistry course, they might make you memorize some of those enzymes. Not super fun, but good to know about because glycolysis is a very important reaction. But for us, we just need to know that they're organized in these pathways. So let's look at the biggest anabolic pathway on Earth. Here we have the photosynthesis reaction. Okay, there's many different ways we can look at this. We can look at the overall kind of chemical formula. Please don't memorize this chemical formula. Don't memorize the balancing of it. What I want you to know about this chemical formula is what goes in and what comes out. So here, what goes in? Carbon dioxide and water. We add light energy, and we end up producing glucose and oxygen as a waste product. So if we look at it in a different way with the chloroplast, carbon dioxide is going in. Those carbon dioxides get stuck together using water and light energy to form sugar, and oxygen is a waste product that comes out of this. Each of the steps in this is part of the photosynthetic reaction called the Calvin cycle. Each of these is catalyzed by an enzyme, right? Enzymes catalyze each step. So taking these molecules of CO2 and sticking them together, there's an enzyme called rubisco that is important in this. And that's one of the most important enzymes on the planet and most abundant as well. And then there's enzymes that do each of these different steps in here. They're not mentioned here, but they are involved in these processes. So if you're interested in metabolism, you're going to need to know a lot about enzymes. All right, let's look at the opposite reaction, a catabolic pathway where we're breaking things down to release energy, right? Our previous one was anabolic, building things up. Catabolic pathway, we have something like glycolysis and respiration. So if we break this name down, glycolysis, that's breaking sugar apart, and we'll see respiration here in a bit, but there's a whole series of reactions that take glucose in, C6H12O6, use oxygen with that to break glucose down into carbon dioxide and water, and in the process, energy is released. We will capture that energy in the form of ATP. Now you might notice that these reactions are exactly opposite, okay? One is anabolic, building things up, and this one is catabolic, breaking things down. We have to put energy into one, and we release energy from the other. But there's totally different sets of enzymes that go into these chemical reactions here. All right, so we'll learn about many of these pieces here in the glycolysis process, and then we go to the mitochondria, and we do this thing called respiration, which generates ATP. So bioenergetics is really about chemistry, right? But it's the flow of energy throughout the system. Some organisms do a large number of anabolic reactions, and then some annoying little critter comes along and steals that and does catabolic reactions with it. But don't worry, this helps disperse the seed, right? So the plant gets something out of it for its investment of energy. In a larger ecological sense, right, when we think about this whole interconnectedness, we have several groups of organisms. Here we have at the top the producers, right, that we call the autotrophs. So auto means self, and troph means feeding. These produce organic compounds from inorganic substances like CO2, right? So they take CO2 in and make organic compounds out of them. They make sugar. Okay, so they take carbon dioxide, water, build sugar out of that process. So here we have our autotrophs, plants, algae. A lot of bacteria do this as well. They produce oxygen as a waste product in there, which is useful because the other group, heterotrophs, get their energy from complex organic molecules that come from other organisms. They can't make their own food. They have to eat something else. So down here we have animals, fungi. A lot of bacteria do this as well. I don't know why the human is naked in here, but we are heterotrophs, right? So we eat these sugars from these things or other things that have eaten these organisms, and we break them down into carbon dioxide and water. And there's a whole cycle here, right? The carbon cycles around. The carbon goes into photosynthesis, gets put into sugars. We break the sugars down, produce carbon dioxide. There is a cycle. That said, the autotrophs don't really need us in this cycle, okay? But we definitely need the autotrophs in the cycle. So we're really dependent on plants, okay? They don't really need us. We help, but not that much, right? So if we look at the evolution of metabolism, we actually start out kind of not doing what we call aerobic metabolism. We start out with anaerobic metabolism. So an means without, and aerobic means oxygen. So anaerobic metabolism means metabolism without oxygen. Now, that might seem strange, right? You need oxygen to live, right? But there's a whole group of organisms that oxygen is toxic to them. And when we look at the early Earth, there's actually very little oxygen on early Earth. So anaerobic metabolism evolved first. It's only after we start getting those photosynthetic reactions occurring that we start to see things evolve into an aerobic metabolism type of lifestyle, because there was finally enough oxygen around to make this worthwhile. This produces way more energy than anaerobic. We'll see that later, but it has evolved as life on Earth has grown. All right, so this diagram, I love this diagram. It is really good because it illustrates the two types of metabolic pathways here. Anabolic, we take small molecules and add energy and assemble them into larger ones, but we got to spend energy there. Catabolic reactions, on the other hand, we take large molecules, break them down into smaller ones, and in the process release energy from this. This is going to be central to all the things we're going to talk about in the next few chapters. Bioenergetics on Earth, we're looking at energy starting at the sun and flowing down through organisms. But at every step, we're losing some energy to heat always. Metabolism, that's all the chemical reactions that occur in a cell. Metabolic pathways are a series of biochemical steps that occur. And then we talked about autotrophs. Those are producers that make complex organic molecules from inorganic substances. So that's like, I take CO2, I stick CO2 together to make sugar, a complex organic molecule. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, doing that reaction in reverse. They're taking energy from complex organic molecules, usually by eating other organisms. All right, we'll get a little more into some chemistry and physics here in the next section.